Right. Good evening, everybody. Really seems a little bit strange, but at least it's great to be able to talk to people even via this new technology, which I think, as we've just seen, does have a few momentary hiccups. And in fact, when Alan, just after last year's Heritage event, when Alan asked me if I would be happy to give the opening talk for 2020, I was absolutely delighted. I thought that would be super, and I was in fact very flattered. Now I'm beginning to wonder if I'm serving as the dummy run, not that any of us could have foreseen 12 months ago where we would be now. But no matter, I am going to talk to you about three remarkable scientists who have left us enduring legacies. But before we really get going, I feel that I should offer a disclaimer. I am no scientist, possibly with all the muttering that was going on behind the scenes with me saying, help, help, can you get this sorted out, to my scientific husband, you possibly guessed. I am in fact a social historian, specializing in women in and immediately after World War I. I hope that the stories of three women of science I'm going to tell you about will intrigue you enough for you to forgive my own scientific deficiencies. So, first up is Elizabeth Ross. As a child, she had dreamed, not of being a scientist or a doctor, but an explorer. The nursery rug, she explained, served as Suleiman's carpet. These dreams were temporarily put on hold when she studied medicine at Queen Margaret College in Glasgow, graduating in 1901, aged 23, thereby becoming one of Scotland's first female doctors. No mean achievement, as women students were not permitted access to clinical studies, were segregated from the men. Many of the lecturers made it very obvious they didn't want them to be there in the first place, and indeed often asked them to sit facing the back of the room as opposed to the front of the lecture theatre. Nevertheless, Elizabeth gained her medical qualifications and then moved to the Highlands and Islands, and then in 1906, she read an advertisement, "Lady Doctor wanted in the East." Fortified with multiple injections against, as she put it, all manner of infectious diseases, she applied for a passport. No questions then about whether they should be maroon or blue, they were just a piece of paper. And with her passport in her pocket, she set off. An inauspicious arrival in Iran, with cholera having been tracked and traced to a previous port of call, all passengers on the ship and the crew were quarantined. A band of pilgrims having tried to escape, all detainees were placed under armed guard. This consisted of sentries with drawn swords. No mucking around with apps in the so-called world-class track and trace system then. You were kept under armed guard. Once out of quarantine, despite its exotic surroundings, her workplace did not live up to her expectations. In fact, she explained, it was reminiscent of a most respectable English suburb, brimful of snobbery and small-mindedness. 2 years later, and now speaking fluent Persian, she was off again, this time to work amongst the powerful Bakhtiara tribe, who lived in the mountains and upland valleys of south-central Iran. Her duties included working amongst the ladies of the harem. Her arrival there was somewhat auspicious. Having twice been attacked by brigands, she entered the principal city, Shiraz, surrounded by 200 armed Indian troops. The bean counters in Whitehall wanted to know how much this had set the UK taxpayer back. Entering into her patients' lives, their pleasures and their pains, their work and their pastimes, she gained what we would term privileged insider insight into a way of life that few people from the West had ever understood. Given the honorary title of Bibi, or chieftainess, and the nickname Blazing Flower, she adopted native dress, albeit minus the veil, and her reputation resulted in her travelling widely across what the British considered bandit country. On one occasion, she was captured, imprisoned, and only her connection with the Bakhtiari saved her from, no doubt, an unpleasant fate. The English press had a field day condemning the lawlessness in Persia, where a woman doing humanitarian work is harassed and robbed. She herself made light of the experience. For anyone interested in travel writing, her A Lady Doctor in Bakhtiara Land is both a witty and insightful account of her 5 years in Persia, at a time when, as she puts it, the country was oscillating between West and East, and by the way, it is actually still available online. Misogyny and the influence of Islam and the mullahs was yet to be felt. She commented that whilst the harem ladies may have carried a miniature Quran about their person, this was adorned by jewels and images of their husband, little, if any, attention being paid to its spiritual efficacy. Despite being bewitched by Persia, she was eager for different experiences and opportunities. On long leave home, she studied for a diploma in tropical medicine. Then, scanning the situation's vacant columns of the medical press, she noticed one for a ship's surgeon. Despite her gender, she was appointed, becoming the world's first female ship surgeon, initially on SS Nigaristan and subsequently SS Glenlogan. The latter was sunk by enemy action in 1916, the former in 1941. Elizabeth visited India, China, Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore. But still, Persia beckoned. Offered the directorship of a proposed new hospital for women in Tehran, and torn between her love for the Bakhtiari, who were desperate for her to return, and the dire medical conditions in Tehran, her humanitarian instincts, which would mark the remainder of her life, kicked in. 1914 found her back in Persia, a spectator, as the world descended into war. In the late autumn of 1914, she heard of the terrible medical situation in Serbia, recently attacked by Austro-Hungary. The majority of the country's 400 qualified doctors was serving with the army. The situation was, quite simply, desperate. Ross volunteered her services, borrowing money from a servant in order to pay her fare. In January 1915, she arrived at Kragujevac Infectious Diseases Hospital, Serbia, now acting as the first reserve military hospital. War casualties and infectious disease patients were quite literally piled in together. It was, even for Ross with a gift for descriptive writing, quite simply, indescribably awful. There were no beds, no bedding other than the dirty straw, and even worse, no disinfectants, medicines, medical instruments, syringes, and no means of cooking any food, of which there was almost none anyway, and the water supply broke down almost continuously. Patients looking like living corpses flooded in every day. Serbia was in the grip of a spotted typhus epidemic, with patients lying on the floor so close together it was impossible to get near them, the dead and dying intermingling with the still just living. By the time Elizabeth arrived, only 2 doctors were left standing. One of them, the medic in charge, Dr. Dimitri Antic, who had himself miraculously recovered from typhus, wrote, "It is my duty to mention with special gratitude Dr. Miss Elizabeth Ross, who day and night, without any fear for her own life, worked tirelessly to treat soldiers with typhus. There were almost no nurses, as these had either died or were desperately ill themselves." He added, "Ross worked on with a fearlessness and devotion to duty which was an example to us all. I visited her one night, and the corridors alike were crowded with patients lying often 2 in one bed or 3 in 2. Nurse Louisa Jordan, who was also working in Serbia and who had spent years working in some of Great Britain's worst Victorian slums, came to visit her by now notorious hospital and said, "Dr. Ross, I don't know how you can bear to work here." And she just said, "Well, somebody's got to do it." Within 3 weeks, Ross too was desperately ill with typhus, probably bitten by a delirious patient. Louisa immediately volunteered to nurse her. To no avail. Elizabeth Ross died on the 14th of February 1915, her 37th birthday. Reflecting on Ross's death and her funeral with full military honours, Louisa wrote the next day in her diary, It seemed so hard that such a useful life should be taken away. She was a true heroine in every sense of the word. Tragically, the following Sunday, the British medical personnel and their Serb allies once again gathered for a military funeral, that of Louisa Jordan, who had herself succumbed to typhus. A footnote to Louisa's story is that the Glasgow Nightingale Hospital, so recently opened, was named the Louisa Jordan Hospital. At Ross's funeral service, much reported in the British press, a Serbian dignitary's words proved prophetic. He informed onlookers that Ross had come amongst us as a woman of science, of nobility and of self-denial, whose memory will live forever in the Serbian heart. Indeed, a Kragujevac street is still named after her, and on the 14th of February 1977, the town started holding annual commemorations, and this is now an important date in both the town and wider Serbia's calendar. Hundreds attend, including the British ambassador. Members of the youth movement of the local Red Cross, known as the Dr. Elizabeth Ross Society, attend the annual commemoration, wearing T-shirts emblazoned with Ross's graduation picture. A remarkable canonization for a woman of science who simply felt she was doing her job. We'll now turn the clock back to 1895 and German scientist Wilhelm Röntgen's invention of radiography. Its potential usefulness for war wounds and locating bullets was almost immediately realized. Within 6 months, X-rays were being used in Italy's Ethiopia campaign. In 1897, Britain took X-ray equipment to the northwest frontier. And the following year, Elizabeth Fleischmann radiographed American casualties on their return to San Francisco during the 1898 Spanish-American War. Fast forward now to the outbreak of World War I. Knowing that radiology would play a crucial role in assisting the French wounded, Nobel laureate Marie Curie immediately approached the French medical authorities, suggesting she design a mobile X-ray vehicle. Met with delaying tactics, she galvanized French women to fund a radiology car, which was used so successfully at the 1914 Battle of the Marne that she soon had a fleet of 20 vehicles manned by a total of 150 women, all trained by her for battlefield radiology. Another, extraordinarily gifted but almost unknown female scientist, Curie's close contemporary, would also make a very significant contribution to battlefield radiology. So let us now meet the remarkable, some would say remarkably difficult, Edith Ann Stoney. Born in January 1869, it was soon blindingly obvious that both Edith and her slightly younger sister Florence were gifted scientists. Edith's particular talents lent towards mathematics, Florence's towards medicine. Having won a coveted scholarship to Newnham College, Cambridge, in 1893, Edith gained an equivalent first in mathematics. But as it will be another 50 years before women were awarded degrees at Cambridge, she did not officially graduate, but was later awarded both a BA and an MA by Trinity College, Dublin. Following this success, Edith went to Newcastle to work for Charles Parsons, considered world-class engineers in marine propulsion and electrical power generation. Now part of Siemens, in Parsons' day, they employed preeminent engineers. It was Edith who came up with a solution to gyrostatic forces that had defeated the male engineers. In case you are wondering, my physicist husband told me that this stops engines shaking themselves to bits, which sounds quite useful. This resulted in the development in 1897 of the steam-powered turbine engine subsequently used to power dreadnoughts. Parsons recognized that Edith's ability for applied mathematics far surpassed his own or his male mathematicians. Edith next gained a lectureship in physics at the London School of Medicine for Women. She designed both the laboratory and the physics course. By now, radiography had sparked both her and her sister Florence, now a qualified doctor's, interest, and in 1901 they jointly set up and opened a new X-ray service at London's Royal Free Hospital. They were soon recognised as, despite their gender, being amongst the UK's leading experts in this new field. On the day war was declared, the Stonies offered their services as medical radiographers to the War Office. What do you imagine the result of this offer was? You've probably guessed correctly. They were rejected because they were women. Florence would eventually fare better than Edith. In March 1915, she was appointed head of radiology at the Fulham Military Hospital, the first medical woman to be appointed by the War Office. We shall now leave her in her labs and follow Edith to the front. Edith herself knew that without the benefit of being a medical practitioner, she needed to find her own route to war. And in June 1915, having resigned her lectureship and received a golden farewell of the then huge sum of £300, which at a rough estimate is about 30,000 today, she joined the suffrage-supported Scottish Women's Hospital Unit for Foreign Service, who were establishing a 250-bed tented hospital near Troyes in France, funded by the Cambridge Women's Colleges of Girton and Edith's old college, Newnham. Edith was to plan and operate the X-ray unit. With no existing X-ray facilities, Edith established them in the stable block. She would soon be adept at setting up her department in the most uncongenial of surroundings. In October 1915, she made the game-changing discovery that X-rays could diagnose gas gangrene, which was caused through a germ in French agricultural soil. Whereas formerly the diagnosis of such a condition had taken a minimum of 36 hours, now diagnosis was instantaneous. Her slides, dated 3rd of October 1915, are now displayed in the Royal College of Surgeons, and they are believed to be the earliest record of this most terrible of all the horrors connected with the war. Dramatic in its onset, the speed of its progress, and its frequently fatal outcome, gas gangrene reaped, as she put it, a cruel harvest of our young and vigorous manhood. I do suggest that anybody who is squeamish looks away for a second, because I've got an image of gas gangrene and it's not pretty. Got there. I do beg your pardon. At times, 90% of a hospital's patients presented with gas gangrene, for which, before Edith's localization of its source, the only remedy was amputation of the affected limb. The Troyes Hospital, with its all-female staff of some 60 doctors, nurses, auxiliaries, ambulance drivers, and of course radiologist Edith, now became a victim of their own success. And in September, having proved adept at running a tented hospital, they were ordered by the French medical authorities to accompany the French Armée de l'Orient, who were heading to the desperate situation in Serbia. Edith immediately foresaw problems, something she was very good at doing, which earned her the reputation of being a Jeremiah. Deeply concerned about the potential non-availability of electricity in Serbia, she made the not unreasonable sounding request of a portable generator. Showing the foresight that would become the hallmark of her war service, when this was turned down, she quite simply went absent without leave and bought one herself. She was acquiring the reputation of being something of a loose cannon. The generator was subsequently used not only to produce X-rays, but also to provide lighting for all the hospital's departments. Leaving from Marseille in late October 1915, after briefly stopping in Malta, already a huge overseas hospital base, they headed to Salonika, their jumping-off point for Serbia. A letter to Florence gives an insight into Edith's frame of mind. The ship is perilously low in the water. No boat drill, few lifeboat belts, and the boats could not have coped with 1/10 of the passengers. But luckily, no disaster overtook us. I could not have faced the risk of being inefficient. We are all out to do the best we can and give the best help which each of us can give. Other things matter very little these days. They arrived in Salonika on the 3rd of November 1915. They were to create a casualty clearing station in the Vardar Valley, just north of the present boundary between Greece and the Republic of Macedonia. For women to be asked to create a casualty clearing station was a real accolade, as this placed them far closer to the front line than was normal, even for medical women. The hospital would be a tented one, with staff accommodation and administration in an empty silk factory which lacked all basic amenities. With no glass in the windows, the cold was intense. The hospital tents could not be put up for several days owing to the unit's tent poles having, to their dismay, been stolen on the way up from Salonika. With no provision having been made for the Serbian wounded, the suffering was indescribable, and the women were determined to be up and running as fast as possible, with or without tent poles. Edith's problem-solving skills were soon on display. As one member of staff explained, the building was lit by electricity from top to bottom on the first evening by the intrepid Miss Stoney, who had been clambering about on the rafters all day like a sailor in the rigging and had finished the job by dusk. Her foresight in bringing the generator from Paris paid off, as they now had electricity and, more importantly to Edith, despite the room designated as the X-ray lab being dangerously small and stuffy, it was functioning. No mean achievement for a middle-aged woman of her diminutive build, working single-handedly in the bitter cold of a Serbian winter. With the wounded pouring in, Edith was continuously on duty. One woman wrote, "The days were bad enough, for we were constantly in the open, but the nights seemed interminable. The jackals kept up an uncanny howling in the camp where they came to seek food and corpses. Cutting-edge radiography was now operating in the land that time forgot." Worse even than the cold and the jackals was the sure and certain knowledge that Serbia would soon be overrun by the Austrians. On the 4th of December 1915, barely a month after they had arrived, orders were given to prepare to retreat. What had just been installed had to be uninstalled and repacked, leaving nothing behind that could be of any material use to the enemy. Not that the Scottish Women's Hospital units were in the habit of leaving anything behind. They knew that every piece of equipment, from X-ray apparatus down to the very last bandage, had been bought with money fundraised across the UK, generally by supporters of suffrage societies. Having retreated on the 6th of December, back near Salonika, the redoubtable Miss Stoney had the whole camp lit by electricity in record time. 10 days later, the whole hospital was functioning, with considerable thanks to Edith, as a young medic, Dr. Emsley explained. She is a learned scientist, no longer young, a mere wraith of a woman. She could carry heavy loads of equipment, repair electric wires sitting astride ridge tents in a howling gale, and work tirelessly on an almost starvation diet. A Canadian doctor, also working in Salonika, commented that she gave the impression of a reed that might snap in two when the wind blew. She's a funny-looking, frowsy old maid with untidy grey hair and large blue eyes. She is a most weird old person, very intent on her job, no special friends, no other interests, in and out of the X-ray rooms and developing rooms like a moth. The double emphasis on old does seem unfair. She was, at this stage, 48, although perhaps sitting astride ridge tents in howling gales had aged her somewhat. Edith's truly exceptional photographic and localization skills were ever more apparent. For Dr. Louise McElroy, the unit's chief medical officer, her minute and thorough grasp of the physical sciences has rendered her far more useful than a medical graduate could ever have been. I have never failed to find pieces of projectiles in wounds which have been photographed by Miss Stoney's stereoscopic process. Whenever Edith was in charge of the equipment, this was soon up and running, but when she was not in control, the outcome was often less positive. This happened with the X-ray ambulance car, purchased at considerable cost and after a huge fundraising drive in Scotland. As Marie Curie had discovered, these mobile units were worth their weight in gold, as they provided a service for hospitals without their own X-ray equipment. At Edith's request, the Edinburgh Committee of the Scottish Women's Hospital Unit had agreed to finance one, but, stupidly, they took no notice of her very detailed recommendations on the requirements for such a vehicle, nor her request to go and see it before it was shipped over to Salonika, a long and indeed perilous journey. The Edinburgh radiologist who was on the equipment committee had no experience of conditions outside her large city hospital and her own consulting room, let alone in a field hospital in time of war. The vehicle had a clearance of only 5.5 inches from the ground, making it totally unsuitable for the half-made vertiginous mountain roads it would have to travel up. The van's engine also drove the X-ray dynamo, which caused too much vibration for the taking of radiographs. To top it all, local patriotism demanded that the X-ray apparatus be purchased from a Glasgow manufacturer. It turned into an expensive white elephant that would have been avoided had Edith's advice been heeded. With Serbia well and truly defeated, the numbers of wounded in Salonika decreased dramatically, and by early 1917, Edith's radiography skills were less in demand. Her developments in electrotherapy could easily be assumed by other staff. With the hospital now dealing with far more cases of disease than war wounds, Chief Medical Officer Louise McIlroy felt it was time to send Edith and her talents back to France. Always hypersensitive to criticism, even where none existed nor was implied, Edith was outraged, writing in a furious letter to Florence, "I saved this corps from utter inefficiency as a surgical corps in Serbia." This was indeed true. She and her generator had saved the day. In May 1917, there were attempts to appoint her as head radiologist in a British hospital camp in Salonika, but this was countermanded in London. The War Office said it had no woman radiologist abroad, therefore, as there was no precedent, it could not have one, however expert she may be. Once again, misogyny deprived British soldiers of her skills, and now French ones would again benefit, just as Serbian ones had been doing for the past year, and for which she was awarded the Serbian Order of St. Sava. In September 1917, Edith arrived back in France at Villers-Cotterêts, a hutted hospital quite close to the French front line, about 50 miles northeast of Paris. It was, she told Florence, very wet, drifting mist everywhere. I have not yet got the X-rays into working order, damp running down the walls and through the roof of the X-ray shed. Last night flooded the floor and put out the stove. I am very aghast at present at the makeshift way the apparatus has been set up. One is always frightened at a new job. In typical Edith fashion, she rolled up her sleeves, becoming general handywoman, seeing to drains, broken windows, lighting the stove, and washing floors, as well as performing 1,500 X-ray examinations in just over a month. As the Western Front stalemate of 1917 gave way to the intense activity of late March to May 1918, with the Germans throwing everything they had into the campaign in order to achieve a breakthrough before the American troops finally arrived, the German army made a dash for the Channel ports. Determined not to move until the last possible moment, Edith and the Villers-Cotterêts team were still hard at work, even when the town was blazing. We dared show no light, and the doctors operated by the light of a 50-candle power electric lamp I had stuck in a cocoa tin to shade or shield the candles. The engine had to be run for X-rays, and as the electrician had fled to the fields, we also had to see to run the engine. I was sent to bed at 4 a.m. and on duty again 3 hours later. We worked till 4 p.m. Thursday the 30th of May, seeing X-ray cases. Then the order came to pack up, finally. Whole of the X-ray equipment repacked by 6 p.m. and we went for supper. During supper, the shelling began. We left for Royaumont, We were heavily bombed along the way, roads simply black with troops, big guns going one way, refugees the other. The younger members of staff had set off to walk the 40 miles to Royaumont, where the Scottish Women's Hospital base unit was, hoping to hitch a lift along the way. The older ones, which included Edith, had the dubious pleasure of cattle trucks, with her standing guard over her precious equipment. No sooner had she arrived in Royaumont than she heard that the Germans had not yet taken Villers-Cotterêts, so, with 2 other members of staff, she simply decided to return there to salvage what they could. Shelling began almost as soon as they arrived. Having loaded the car with all it could carry, Edith and her helpers started to walk the 40 miles. Renewed bombing on the road forced them to stay in the fields overnight. Undeterred, back in Royaumont, she had her x-rays up and running within 24 hours and was forbidden to return to Villers-Cotterêts for the last pieces of equipment. This troubled her, and she wrote and apologised to the Edinburgh committee, who, I trust, will realise the difficulties before blaming me too much for the heavy loss of apparatus entrusted to my care. Unsurprisingly, she was reckoned to be one of the most outstandingly useful members of staff. By July 1918, due to burns and having a bad varicose leg, she was placed on sick leave. One of her team noted she had worked like a Trojan, and what an amount of abstruse knowledge she possesses, adding that her interpersonal skills did not match her professional ones. Sadly, this is a constant comment in all references to her. This lack of what we would call emotional intelligence hounded her throughout her war service, compounded by what was undoubtedly increasing shell shock. In this she was not alone. The German breakthrough of the end of May had pushed several nursing and medical personnel over the edge, and they were cracking under the physical and mental strain. 2 were invalided home with complete nervous collapse. The unit was reduced to 13, as opposed to what was considered the minimum of 17 medics. When Edith returned from sick leave, it was to new staff, and she had to check all their work personally, and for over 5 weeks she did not get a break. She felt that the new staff who had not seen her in action during the time at Villers-Cotterêts did not respect her, as she did not have a medical degree. This was constantly at the root of her relationship difficulties. She told Florence, "The sister did not like to work under me as I was not qualified medically." A product of her age, she added, "The senior sister used language I could not have passed over." Reading between the lines, 2 very prickly women who had lived through unimaginable strain, always having to learn on the job and adapt, went head, to neither's credit. As the war entered its final stages, aware that radiology's inestimable service in battlefield surgery needed to be recorded, Edith was desperate to leave a record of all the work that had been achieved. And as the Scottish Women's Hospital unit in Royaumont started to close down, she and her 2 assistants embarked on their final contribution to the developing field of wartime radiography. This involved preserving a record of the X-ray prints of all the 4 years. Due to pressure of work, no regular record had been made, and aware of the contribution it would make to the advancement of radiography, she wanted to remedy this. Now, another personality clash did her and medical history a great disservice. The Doctor-in-Chief, Dr. Frances Ivans, made a major error of judgment, and she put the X-ray plates out of Edith's charge and into those of a Sister McAllister. Edith added she had not the necessary professional education to see their great value or to keep the card index. Edith had carefully made stereoscopic images, which is a technique that she had established, which enables an in-depth localization of bullets and shrapnel. McAllister seems to have thought that they were duplicates and destroyed one of each pair. That's just to give you an idea of how a stereoscopic image works. And it actually, when you use a little bit like a viewfinder, you get a depth that you don't get from a normal image. The loss of one of each pair was a shattering blow to so conscientious a scientist, and also a valuable record was lost. An exhausted and depressed Edith left France in February 1919. Florence was shocked at the sight of her, both emotionally and physically, commenting that few people realize what the constant strain of X-ray work in the dark and stuffy atmosphere and with X-rays about mean to the worker. If she had been in the army, she would have had a pension, but that is one of the things when it is hard to be a woman. That was an important point. Financially, Edith needed to find work at the end of the war. She received a number of medals, but no pension. I would love to recount that post-war she had a glittering career in radiography. Sadly, this is not the case. She met considerable resistance when she tried to capitalize on her radiological skills, honed during 3.5 years of war, both because she was not medically qualified and also because she was a woman. Now recognized as the first female medical physicist, whose outstanding services had saved hundreds of lives and preserved limbs that otherwise would have been amputated, the only post she could find was a lectureship in physics, which sounds okay, until I add that it was in the Household and Social Science Department at King's College for Women, which offered a glorified domestic science qualification. A significant contrast to her wartime achievements, which included being decorated with the Serbian Order of St. Seva, the French Croix de Guerre, and the French Médaille des Épidémies. Retiring in 1925, during her retirement, Edith became one of the earliest and oldest members of the Women's Engineering Society, and she played an active part in the organisation until shortly before her death. She travelled widely, and in 1934 she spoke to the Australian Federation of University Women about women in engineering, highlighting women's now overlooked wartime contributions. In 1936, she established the Johnstone and Florence Stoney Studentship for research in biological, geological, meteorological, or radiological science. Still in existence, the studentship supports clinical medical students going abroad for their elective period. Edith died aged 69 on the 25th of June, 1938. Belatedly recognizing her as a pioneer of medical physics, obituaries were printed in both the scientific and medical press, in national newspapers in England, and even as far away as Australia. In scientific circles, she is still remembered for her considerable bravery and resourcefulness in the face of extreme danger, and her imaginative contributions to clinical care under the most difficult conditions of war. One story that did not make it into her obituaries was related by Dr. Elizabeth Courtauld, originally from Halstead. When they were both working at Royaumont, one young doctor begged Elizabeth to take Stoney for a walk in the forest. "If you do, I shall get you an egg for breakfast. And if you take her for a walk and lose her, I'll give you 2. And that was when eggs were scarce. So many of the scientific women who carved out unusual roles for themselves in World War I were larger-than-life characters. They had fought to qualify in their professional spheres when the dice were so heavily loaded against women. Aware that they could assist the wounded, they had founded their own military hospitals. Maybe it is not surprising that compromise, with either professional standards or with each other, was not a word that figured in their vocabulary. And that is what makes them such fascinating characters to research. If war service ultimately defined both Elizabeth and Edith's lives, our third woman of science star was fully on the ascendant post-war, although that is not to say that when she really came to the public's attention in the aftermath of war, that she did not already have an enviable reputation as a leading scientist. In 1904, the University of Manchester created the post of lecturer in paleobotany for an academic whose recent research had solved what Charles Darwin had called an abominable mystery, the evolutionary origin of flowers. This had granted celebrity status to the person who was Britain's youngest doctor of science of either gender. When, to the University of Manchester's horror, they realised that their new appointee was female, the offer was unsuccessfully rescinded. They would soon discover both Marie Stopes' refusal to be cowed and her ability to use influential friends to further her cause. Once appointed, she began crawling down inhospitable Lancashire coal mines, collecting 300-million-year-old plant fossils which shed light on the coal, which enabled Great Britain to retain its imperial position and fuel its industries. The practical importance of her work is evident still today when anyone flicks on a light switch. Her findings are used to optimize the way coal is burned in power stations and are key to efficient generation of electricity. A glittering academic career seemed assured. In 1912, having married a Canadian botanist, Stopes, who insisted on retaining her maiden name, accepted a lectureship at her alma mater, University College London. Learned associations soon invited her as a guest speaker. Here, she honed her public speaking skills and learned to handle hecklers. Both would stand her in excellent stead. However, her private life was going less well. Concerned that she had not become pregnant, and with such subjects deeply taboo, she began her own research into her marital problems via the dusty volumes locked away in the cupboard of the British Museum. Her doctoral thesis may have studied the sexual habits of certain primitive plants. Her knowledge of human reproduction was close to non-existent. Giving up on her marriage, she finally left the marital home in 1914 and pitched her new home, a tent, in Northumberland. In 1916, her marriage was annulled. The British government now commissioned her as a coal expert. Her monograph on the constitution of coal changed the way that coal was both burned in power stations, on ships, and classified. And her classification for coal is still used today. By now, Stopes had met American birth control campaigner Margaret Sanger, who was in England fleeing a potential 12 years prison sentence for her dissemination of contraceptive advice, illegal under America's Comstock laws. Working amongst desperately poor women, Sanger had witnessed unimaginable misery caused by continuous pregnancies. She had started a monthly magazine, Woman Rebel, which included articles on sex education for girls from 14 to 18, and founded a national birth control league. The Stopes-Sanger meeting changed the direction of Stopes' public and private life. Through her growing interests in the birth control movement, Stopes met and married a wealthy Royal Flying Corps officer, Humphrey Roe, himself committed to providing working-class women with contraceptive advice. Impressed by the book Stopes had been working on since 1916, Married Love, for which she had failed to find a publisher, Humphrey offered to put up the £200, about £13,000 today, which the small publishing house Fifield & Co. demanded. Neither Stopes, Roe, nor even the publisher could have anticipated its February 1918 success. It ran through 6 printings in a matter of weeks. It was immediately banned in the USA and remained banned for over 20 years. To prevent the book being tossed aside as smut, Stopes' impressive qualifications, Doctor of Science, London, Doctor of Philosophy, Munich, Fellow of University College, London, Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature were prominently placed. It even carried an endorsement from a Catholic priest. Her battles with the Roman Catholic Church lay in the future. Striking, although rarely commented upon, is that 73 years ahead of her time in English law, Stopes implies that rape can exist within marriage. No means no. Married Love only touched upon the subject that would form Stopes' life work, although she never lost her interest in paleobotany. Contraception came to the fore in Wise Parenthood, published in November 1918. Aware that contraception was only easily available to educated middle and upper class couples who could afford to pay for the privilege of limiting their families, she wrote a 16-page pamphlet for poorer women, A Letter to Working Mothers, 1919. Her attempts to get this disseminated in the East End were greeted with suspicion, partly because the distributors were confused with being from the welfare. Working class women were only too familiar with their lives being snooped upon by middle-class do-gooders keen to criticise their homes and their families and, during the war, withhold their separation allowances. 1919, which began with the runaway success of Wise Parenthood, was marred by the stillbirth of her longed-for first child. She blamed medical incompetence for the tragedy. Flattened by grief, it was becoming apparent that significant parts of the press, particularly the Times, now had her in their cross sights. Letters in the press accused married love of offering dirty advice. Such diatribes were soon as familiar as the adulatory letters which filled her own and her publisher's mailbox. By 1920, Stopes and Rose Thoughts were turning towards opening their own birth control clinic. But contraception needed public endorsement from a high authority. With the forthcoming Lambeth Palace Conference of Anglican Bishops, Stopes, who now saw herself as something between a prophetess and a priestess, adopted the role of God's emissary. She contacted the 267 Episcopal attendees, advising them to encourage the widespread use of contraceptives among their flock. The generally unmarried bishops countered by emphasizing the grave physical, moral, and spiritual perils incurred by the use of contraceptives. Thousands of women begged to differ, informing Stopes, "The bishops don't have to have children. They are not the people to judge whether birth control is right or wrong." Continuing with her rather bizarre ecclesiastical campaign, following the receipt of a number of agony aunt-type letters from clergymen's wives, in 1922 she sent a questionnaire inquiring about their sexual habits to 2,000 randomly selected Anglican clergymen. The number of answers she received was disappointing. Stopes next tried royalty. However, Queens Alexandra and Mary graciously declined to accept copies of her books. Subsequently, Princess Elizabeth and her Prince Philip accepted her 1947 wedding gift of Married Love, which she hoped they would read together. By September 1920, loved or loathed, Stopes' opinions counted. For good or ill, she was present in the nation's bedrooms. Nowadays, it is hard to fully comprehend that she really was a pioneer with most people, including medical graduates, having little scientific knowledge or understanding of contraception, which in fact was not included in the medical curriculum. Dr. Isabel Emsley, who had so admired Edith Stoney's capabilities, remembered that when she qualified, the whole subject was taboo. Not only was it taboo in medical education, contraception advice was banned from Ministry of Health infant welfare clinics run by the government, although not from private ones, whose fees were far beyond working class women. One midwife commented, "If it were possible to give information on birth control at infant welfare centres, as freely as it is given about baby feeding, we would do away with much of the unnecessary suffering of both mothers and babies." On the 17th of March 1921, in an event which the Times declined to cover, Stopes and her husband's long-cherished dream reached fulfillment. The Mother's Clinic for Constructive Birth Control opened at 61 Marlborough Road, Holloway. Sandwiched between a grocer's and a confectioner's shop, the house was converted into a clinic which was as friendly and welcoming as possible. Its main aims: help the poor, try to understand working-class attitudes towards both birth control, collect data on contraception, and broaden the scope of knowledge about women. The female nursing staff was supplemented by honorary consultant Harley Street Dr. Jane Lorimer Hawthorne, who visited weekly. She believed women needed contraception as protection against brutal husbands, giving heart-wrenching examples. One patient who had had 15 babies explained, "When I tell him there is another baby coming, he kicks me downstairs." However, not all women doctors were supportive. Some, including Dr. Louise McIlroy, whom we also met in Serbia, claimed that contraception would lead to unbridled sexual activity and excess. Stopes' advocacy of contraception touched a moral and ongoing nerve. A horrified nation had discovered that during the war, some 416,891 British and Dominion heroes had been admitted to hospital suffering from venereal disease. For some, Stopes' book seemed to point the way forward towards harmonious marital relations and a potential reduction in STDs. For others, she was feeding moral degeneracy, threatening to submerge the nation. Arguing contraception would result in moral degeneration and sex excesses would rot the very foundation of society. The Federation of British Medical Women weighed in. Dr. Mary Charlieb, prophesying degeneracy and effeminacy, called for drill halls and tea gardens to be established to divert the men's minds from drink and women. Now we know. Stopes' ability to arouse strong feelings was frequently demonstrated in her exchanges with the medical profession and soon the Roman Catholic Church. She began to develop something of a persecution mania. The aforementioned Louise McIlroy told a distinguished audience attending a July 1921 meeting of the Medico-Legal Society that the consequences of married life should be left in divine hands, citing, as an example, the joy of Irish peasants with large families. Attendees included recent convert to Catholicism, Dr. Halliday Sutherland, who accused Stopes of using her work distributing contraceptives among poor women as a eugenic experiment targeting society's most vulnerable. Capitalizing on the still rampant anti-German feelings, he stressed that a doctor of German philosophy, Munich, has opened a birth control clinic. The remark was disingenuous. Stopes' PhD from the University of Munich was for her thesis on paleobotany. Disregarding legal advice, Stopes sued for libel. The complicated case did no one credit. Cardinal Bourne of Westminster volunteered to assist Sutherland with his legal costs. The case became mired in accusation and counter-accusation. Even the verdict was unclear. In whose favour had the jury really found? The case rumbled on to an unsuccessful appeal to the House of Lords, who on the 4th of December 1924 finally found against Stopes, handing her the hefty bill of costs of £12,000, about £64,000 today. However, the case generated significant publicity and sympathy for Stopes and vastly increased book sales. Many found the outcome terribly unjust. Admirers assured her that she had achieved a breakthrough for womanhood. 4 years after the Mothers' Clinic opened, bigger premises were needed. What is now Marie Stopes Central London Centre, Bloomsbury, opened in 1924. It was still the only clinic to offer contraceptive advice to the poor. Its present-day mission, to give a warm welcome without judgment, where clients feel supported, is in line with Stopes' initial objective of ensuring that there was a kind, non-judgmental heart to listen. Now, the House of Lords entered the free family planning fray. Lord Buckmaster presented a private member's bill, which, once the verbose language is translated into plain speak, called on the government to provide contraceptive advice to the poor. Their lordships became the first legislative body in the world to pass such a bill. However, the House of Commons withdrew the bill. Feminist former suffrage campaigner Sylvia Pankhurst believed that this was out of fear of there not being a continuous supply of labourers or cannon fodder in the case of another war. Stopes was now determined that if family planning was not available in state welfare clinics and with no affordable birth control clinics outside London, then it was time to take contraception to the regions via a birth control caravan. A fund was established to raise the necessary £1,000 or £57,000 today. Mr. Selfridge made a substantial, anonymous donation, but declined her invitation to become a vice president of the movement. The caravan arrived at its first pitch a municipal ground near Bethnal Green Library, on the 6th of June 1928, subsequently moving to Stratford. To us, these locations seem quite close to the Mother's Clinic in Bloomsbury. However, for most clients, going up west would have been akin to entering unknown territory. Pitch locations needed careful selection. Stable or factory yards led to those seeking advice being jeered, with subsequent low attendances. Opening hours had to be flexible to accommodate local work patterns. Midwives did not sleep in the van. Stopes, presciently as it turned out, was concerned for their safety. She now feared Roman Catholic-led sabotage. Not everyone was enthusiastic. On the 24th of November 1928 in Bradford, 34-year-old Elizabeth Ellis set fire to and destroyed the caravan, which she claimed was being used to encourage young girls into prostitution, and that she had destroyed a source of immorality and venereal disease. She tended to think that the midwives were pimps in disguise. Ellis was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment. Determined to replace the van, enough publicity was generated for 2 vans, one for the southern and one for the northern circuit, staying from a few weeks to several months in each venue. These birth control caravans were the forerunners of the mobile NHS centres so familiar to us today. One victory, for which Stopes may have claimed significant responsibility, was that finally, in 1930, official instruction in birth control was included in the medical syllabus. A Ministry of Health circular permitted local health authorities to provide birth control advice for married women for whom a further pregnancy would be detrimental to health. Stopes' mission had far-reaching consequences. On the 31st of December 1930, Pius XI published the first papal encyclical on marriage for 50 years and instructed priests to thunder its message from the pulpits. Contraception was inherently evil, and any spouse practicing any act of contraception violates the law of God and nature and was stained by a great and mortal flaw. This encyclical, Pope Paul VI's reiteration, Humanae Vitae, and ongoing teachings have bound millions of Roman Catholic women across the globe to the chains of continuous pregnancy from which Stopes was seeking to free them. Stopes herself, of course, remains a highly controversial character, not least because of her eugenicism, which now often overshadows her achievements. In 2008, Stopes was one of 6 formidable women to be honoured by a Royal Mail stamp, a decision which a number of individuals and organisations, including feminist ones, condemned. Yet her mother's clinics and the birth control caravans offered free contraception advice to those who could not otherwise afford it, and working class women gained control over their own fertility for the first time. The charity to which she gave her name sums her up admirably. Controversy she may have courted, but it is difficult not to be astounded by Marie Stopes' achievements. Elizabeth Ross, Edith Stoney, and Marie Stopes were all leading female scientists. Determined to pursue their own goals, they allowed no one to stand in their way. As a ship surgeon, Ross sailed as no woman had sailed before. In Serbia, she undertook work that even the most hardy medics balked at, knowingly putting her own life at risk and ultimately losing it. Stoney pioneered wartime radiography. Her skills at isolating the locus of gas gangrene obviated the need for thousands of limbs to be amputated and saved hundreds of lives. Her slides still form a key part of the Royal College of Surgeons' War Radiography Archive. Stopes, aware of the human misery caused by continuous pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing, wanted poorer women to be able to limit their families, just as richer ones could. She led the way in bringing healthcare to those who could not easily access it, pioneering mobile health facilities. Decades ahead of their time, each was a proud scientist, in an era when woman of science was considered a contradiction in terms. Thank you.